The Danube moved slowly that summer, wide, indifferent, and ancient. Its waters cut to the lands of southeastern Europe with a quiet authority that no army had ever truly controlled. Along its southern bank stood the fortress of Nicopolis, stone walls rising above the river, its towers watching both the current and the horizon beyond. By the late 14th century, Nicopolis was no longer just a fortress. It had become a boundary line between worlds. To the north and west lay the fracturing kingdoms of Christian Europe, divided, ambitious, and uneasy. To the south and east stretched the expanding dominion of the Ottoman Empire, whose momentum had not slowed since its first crossings into Europe decades earlier. The old balance was gone, and many in Europe were only beginning to understand what that meant. The fall of Constantinople had not yet come, but its shadow had already begun to stretch across the continent. The Byzantine Empire, once the anchor of Eastern Christendom, had been reduced to a fragile remnant. Its emperor ruled little beyond the walls of the city itself. Its resources were depleted, its allies unreliable, its survival increasingly dependent on diplomacy rather than strength. Beyond those walls, the Ottomans advanced steadily. Villages turned to garrisons. Roads turned to supply routes. Local rulers, some defeated, others coerced, were absorbed into a growing system of tribute and control. What had once seemed like raids now revealed themselves as a pattern. Expansion was no longer opportunistic. It was deliberate. At the center of this expansion stood a ruler whose reputation had begun to solidify across both Europe and Asia. Bayezid I, known as Yildirim, the Thunderbolt. His campaigns were defined by speed, his decisions by urgency, his authority by an increasingly centralized command structure that allowed his armies to move faster than those of his adversaries. Where European coalitions hesitated, debated, and negotiated, Bayezid acted, and by the 1390s, his reach had extended deep into the Balkans. But pressure creates reaction. In Western and Central Europe, reports of Ottoman advances stirred more than concern. They ignited fear, not simply a territorial loss, but of a broader collapse. Trade routes were threatened. Religious authority was challenged. The symbolic weight of Constantinople, though weakened, still held meaning. A response began to take shape. Not a unified strategy, but something older, something familiar. A crusade. The call did not emerge from a single throne. Instead, it formed gradually, carried by messengers, envoys, and clerical appeals across courts and councils. The language was religious, but the motivations were more complex. Some saw opportunity. Others sought redemption. Many hoped to restore prestige. At the center of this coalition stood Sigismund of Hungary. He understood the threat more clearly than most. Hungary was not distant from Ottoman expansion. It was directly exposed to it. Frontier regions had already felt the pressure of raids and shifting allegiances. For Sigismund, this was not an abstract campaign. It was a defensive necessity. But he could not face the Ottomans alone. So he sought support from across Europe. Knights from France answered the call. Burgundian nobles, eager for distinction, prepared their contingents. German forces joined. Smaller groups from England, Italy, and other regions followed. It became a coalition not of unity, but a convergence, a gathering of forces bound by overlapping, but not identical, intentions. This would later matter, because while the crusading army grew in size and prestige, its cohesion remained uncertain. Command structures were unclear. Cultural expectations differed. Strategic priorities were not aligned. And beneath the surface, there was a quiet but persistent tension between experience and confidence. Sigismund and his advisors had fought the Ottomans before. They understood the terrain, the tactics, the speed at which Ottoman forces could respond. Many of the Western knights did not. Their understanding of warfare had been shaped by different battlefields, feudal conflicts, set-piece engagements, and systems where heavy cavalry dominance often dictated outcomes. At Nicopolis, those assumptions would be tested. By the summer of 1396, the crusading force began its advance. The movement itself was slow, not because of hesitation, but because of scale. Thousands of soldiers, horses, supply wagons, and attendants moved across Central Europe toward the Danube. Each crossing required coordination. Each encampment demanded resources. The army grew as it moved, absorbing additional contingents and stretching its logistical chain. Momentum built, but so did complexity. The Danube itself became both a pathway and a constraint. Transporting men and equipment across the river required planning and time. Fleets of boats were assembled. Supplies were stockpiled. The operation resembled not just a military advance, but an expedition into uncertain territory. Meanwhile, Ottoman forces were not idle. Bayezid had been engaged elsewhere, campaigning in Anatolia, consolidating authority among rival Turkish beyliks. But when news of the crusade reached him, his response was immediate. He redirected his forces, not cautiously but decisively. Speed defined the Ottoman reaction. Bayezid's army moved across long distances with a coordination that European observers often underestimated. Light cavalry units advanced rapidly, scouting terrain, relaying information, and disrupting potential resistance. Corps forces followed with discipline, maintaining cohesion even as they covered ground at remarkable pace. This was not a defensive response. It was an interception. Bayezid did not intend to wait behind walls or rely solely on fortified positions. He aimed to meet the Crusaders directly, before they could consolidate their advantage. As the crusading army approached Nicopolis, the city itself became their immediate objective. Its capture would secure a strategic position along the Danube and provide a base for further operations. More importantly, it would signal momentum, a visible success that could justify the scale of the campaign. Siege preparations began. Encampments were established. Positions were assigned. The fortress, though strong, was not considered unassailable. Many among the Crusaders believed that its fall was only a matter of time. But time was exactly what they did not have. Within the Crusader camp, confidence began to grow. Reports suggested that Bayezid was still far away. Some believed he would not arrive in time to challenge them. Others assumed that even if he did, the numerical and qualitative strength of the crusading force would prevail. This confidence was not uniform, but it was influential, particularly among the French knights, whose reputation for aggressive engagement shaped the tone of discussions within the camp. Caution, where it existed, struggled to assert itself. Sigismund advocated for a more measured approach. Reconnaissance, coordination, preparation for a possible field engagement. He understood that the Ottomans would not simply allow Nicopolis to fall, but his authority, though significant, was not absolute. Decisions were increasingly shaped by competing voices. Then came the reports. Scouts returned with confirmation. Ottoman forces were approaching, and faster than expected. The distance between the two armies was closing. Rapidly, what had been a siege was now becoming something else, a confrontation. The landscape around Nicopolis began to take on new meaning. Hills, slopes, and open ground, once secondary considerations, became critical factors in planning. Positions had to be reassessed, lines of movement reconsidered. But time compressed these decisions. The crusading army, still partially oriented toward siege operations, now faced the prospect of open battle against an opponent known for speed and adaptability. And within the camp, unity remained fragile. Some commanders pushed for immediate engagement, seeking to confront Bayezid before he could fully deploy his forces. Others urged restraint, warning that the Ottomans might be drawing them into unfavorable ground. Between these positions lay uncertainty. As evening approached, tension settled over the encampment. Not the loud tension of imminent combat, but something quieter, a recognition that the campaign had reached a point of no return. For many soldiers, this would be their first encounter with Ottoman forces. For others, it would be a return to a kind of warfare that did not follow familiar patterns. There were no guarantees, no clear expectations. Only the knowledge that the next day, or perhaps the next hour, would decide the outcome of a campaign that had drawn together much of Europe's military elite. Across the distance, beyond the line of sight, Bayezid's forces continued their approach, organized, prepared, and moving with purpose. The river remained unchanged. The fortress stood silent. But between them, on the ground where decisions would soon unfold, two armies moved toward each other, each shaped by different assumptions, different structures, and different understandings of war. What followed would not be determined by numbers alone. It would be decided by judgment, by timing, and by the ability or failure to adapt when certainty collapsed. Morning did not arrive with clarity. It came slowly, through mist, dust, and the subdued movement of men preparing for a battle they did not fully understand. The ground south of Nicopolis was uneven, broken by rising slopes and narrow approaches that limited visibility. It was not a battlefield chosen through careful planning. It was one imposed by timing, and timing at Nicopolis would favor only one side. The crusading army, though large, was not arranged as a unified force. It was a coalition in formation as much as in identity. At its core were the heavy cavalry contingents, particularly the French and Burgundian knights, armored, disciplined within their own ranks, and confident in the shock power that had defined their role across generations of European warfare. Around them were infantry units, crossbowmen, and supporting forces drawn from across the continent. Hungarian troops under Sigismund of Hungary formed a critical component. More familiar with the terrain, more experienced in confronting Ottoman tactics, and more cautious in their expectations. But caution did not dominate the field that morning. Across the distance, the army of Bayezid I had already taken position. His force, though smaller in number, was structured with deliberate clarity. Light infantry and irregular units, often referred to in European accounts as skirmishers, were positioned forward. Behind them stood more disciplined formations, including the Janissaries, whose role was not to advance recklessly but to hold, absorb, and stabilize the line when pressure mounted. Cavalry units, both light and heavy, were held in reserve, positioned along the flanks and beyond immediate visibility. It was not a static formation. It was layered. Each element had a function tied to sequence, not simultaneity. Bayezid did not rush the engagement. He understood the tendencies of his opponent. Reports from scouts had already revealed the composition of the crusading force, particularly the presence of heavily armored knights eager for decisive engagement. He knew that if given the opportunity, they would advance, and he intended to let them. Within the Crusader camp, the decision to attack formed not as a single command, but as a convergence of pressure. The French knights, led by high-ranking nobles, argued for immediate action. Delay, in their view, would only give the Ottomans time to strengthen their position. The logic was simple. Strike first, strike hard, and break the enemy before they could organize. Sigismund disagreed. He proposed a more structured approach, one that would use infantry and ranged units to weaken the Ottoman front before committing to cavalry. He emphasized the need to anticipate layered resistance, to avoid overextension, and to maintain cohesion. But his influence met resistance. Not openly, not dramatically, but persistently. Confidence among the knights had its own momentum, and by the time final positions were being arranged, that momentum had already shaped the course of events. The advance began with the cavalry. Thousands of armored riders moved forward in formation, their movement steady at first, then accelerating as distance closed. The sound of hooves on uneven ground merged with the metallic rhythm of armor and equipment, creating a presence that was both physical and psychological. Ahead of them, Ottoman skirmishers did not hold their ground. They withdrew, not in panic, but in sequence. Arrows were released intermittently. Small groups engaged briefly before pulling back. The objective was not to stop the advance, but to shape it, to draw it forward. The terrain amplified the effect. As the knights pushed ahead, the ground began to rise. Visibility narrowed. Formations stretched. What had begun as a coordinated advance gradually lost its alignment. Units moved at different speeds. Gaps formed. Communication weakened. But momentum carried them forward. Stopping at that stage was no longer a simple option. The first significant resistance came not from the skirmishers, but from entrenched positions. Ottoman infantry had prepared defensive lines using stakes and natural obstacles, designed specifically to disrupt cavalry charges. As the knights approached, the effectiveness of these measures became immediate. Horses slowed. Some stumbled. The cohesion of the charge began to break. Yet the knights pressed on. Individually and in smaller groups, they forced their way through the defensive line, engaging Ottoman infantry in close combat. In these moments, their training and equipment gave them an advantage. They pushed through, and for a brief period, it appeared that the initial assault might succeed. But the structure of Bayezid's formation was not defined by a single line. It was defined by depth. Behind the first offensive layer stood the Janissaries, disciplined, organized, and prepared to absorb the impact of the advancing force. Here, the nature of the battle shifted. The knights, having broken through the initial resistance, now found themselves facing a second line that did not collapse under pressure. Engagement became slower, more fragmented. Individual duels replaced coordinated movement. Fatigue began to take hold. And still, they moved forward. What they could not see, what the terrain and their own advance had obscured, was the broader shape of the battlefield. Their charge had carried them beyond support of their own infantry. Behind them, the rest of the crusading army had not advanced at the same pace. The line had stretched, then broken. Sigismund, observing from position further back, recognized the developing situation. The cavalry had advanced too far, too fast. Without support, he attempted to reorganize the remaining forces, preparing to advance in a more controlled manner, to reinforce the forward units and restore cohesion. But time, again, was not on his side. Bayezid had been waiting. As the Crusader cavalry became fully engaged with the Janissary line, the Ottoman flanking units began to move. Cavalry forces, previously held in reserve, advanced along both sides of the battlefield, targeting the exposed flanks and rear of the advancing knights. The effect was not immediate chaos. It was something more controlled. Encirclement began gradually. Routes of retreat narrowed. Pressure increased from multiple directions. For the knights at the front, the shift was difficult to perceive at first. Combat was already intense. Visibility was limited. Communication across units was minimal. But as time passed, the signs became clearer. Resistance was not diminishing. It was strengthening. Attacks came from angles that had previously been open, and attempts to regroup met with obstruction. Behind them, the situation deteriorated further. Ottoman forces engaged the remaining Crusader units before they could fully organize. The lack of unified command structure now became critical. Orders were delayed, misinterpreted, or never received. Some units advanced prematurely. Others held position too long. The coherence of the army, already fragile, began to collapse under pressure. Sigismund attempted to stabilize the situation. He organized a defensive response, coordinating with Hungarian forces to resist the Ottoman advance and create space for regrouping. But the battlefield no longer allowed for controlled maneuvers. The engagement had fragmented into multiple simultaneous conflicts, each influenced by local conditions rather than central command. At the center, the knights who had led the charge were now isolated. Their initial success had carried them into a position they could not sustain. Surrounded, fatigued, and increasingly outnumbered, they continued to fight. But without the structural support that had defined their strength, the logic of their advance, decisive shock, rapid breakthrough, immediate collapse of the enemy, no longer applied. They had entered a different kind of battle, one defined not by impact, but by endurance. Bayezid's control over the field remained intact. His forces moved according to a structure that allowed adaptation without loss of cohesion. Units rotated. Pressure was applied selectively. Encirclement tightened without overextension. It was not a chaotic victory. It was a managed one. As the sun climbed higher, the outcome began to take shape, not as a sudden reversal, but as a gradual realization. The crusading army had committed its strongest element first and lost the ability to support it. Its remaining forces, fragmented and disorganized, could not restore the balance. And the battlefield itself, its slopes, its constraints, its limited visibility, had amplified every miscalculation. What had begun as an offensive had become containment. What had been confidence had become exposure. And at Nicopolis, the distinction between momentum and control was now being defined with increasing clarity. The battle had not yet ended, but its direction was no longer uncertain. By midday, the structure of the crusading army no longer existed as a single force. What remained were fragments, isolated groups of men fighting within shrinking spaces, reacting rather than coordinating, attempting to survive rather than to win. At the center of the battlefield, the forward elements of the cavalry, the same knights who had begun the assault with confidence, were now encircled. The transformation had been gradual. So gradual, in fact, that many did not recognize it until movement became impossible. The pressure came from all directions. Ottoman cavalry, advancing in controlled arcs, closed gaps with precision. Infantry units maintained the interior line, ensuring that those already engaged could not break through. Arrows continued to fall, not in overwhelming volleys, but in steady, targeted releases designed to exhaust and disrupt. There was no single moment of collapse. Instead, there was accumulation. Fatigue layered upon confusion. Confusion layered upon isolation. And isolation eventually led to inevitability. For the knights at the center, the nature of combat had shifted completely. The charge, the defining element of their battlefield identity, had long since ended. Horses were injured, scattered, or killed. Movement was restricted. Engagements became static, close, and increasingly desperate. Armor, once an advantage, now carried weight. Heat built beneath metal. Breathing grew heavier. Time slowed, not because events stopped, but because each moment required more effort than the last. Attempts to regroup failed. There were no clear lines to reform behind, no reserves to rotate forward, no signal system capable of restoring cohesion across the field. Each unit, each cluster of men, was now operating within its own limited awareness, fighting what it could see, reacting to what it could not anticipate. And beyond that immediate field of vision, the broader battle continued to tighten. Further back, the situation deteriorated in a different way. The forces under Sigismund of Hungary had attempted to hold a defensive position to slow the Ottoman advance and create a corridor for retreat or reorganization. But the timing no longer aligned. The forward cavalry had advanced too far, too early. The Ottoman flanking movements had already cut across the remaining space, and what might have been a structured withdrawal became a fragmented disengagement. Sigismund recognized the shift. The battle could not be recovered, not through reinforcement, not through repositioning. The only remaining decision was preservation of what remained of the army and of command itself. Withdrawal, under those conditions, was not a maneuver. It was an escape. Small groups began to pull back toward the Danube, where ships and transport vessels had been positioned earlier in the campaign. Movement toward the river was uneven, interrupted by Ottoman units that continued to apply pressure without overextending. Some formations dissolved entirely before reaching it. Others arrived in disordered waves, attempting to board vessels under conditions that allowed for little coordination. Sigismund himself managed to reach the river. From there, he withdrew, leaving behind a battlefield that no longer resembled the organized confrontation that had begun only hours earlier. His departure was not the cause of collapse. It was a response to it. At the center and across the field, the remaining Crusader forces were now surrounded. Resistance continued, but without direction, without reinforcement, without a realistic objective. The end, when it came, was uneven. Some groups fought until they could no longer continue. Others, recognizing the absence of escape, laid down their arms. Captivity replaced combat, and with it came a different kind of uncertainty. Bayezid I now controlled the field. His forces, though engaged across multiple points, had maintained their structure. Units regrouped, positions stabilized. The layered formation that had defined the battle's opening phases now allowed for an organized conclusion. Victory, in this case, was not sudden. It was confirmed. The aftermath unfolded in stages. Prisoners, particularly among the European nobility, were separated from common soldiers. Ransoms would later define the fate of many high-ranking captives. Others, without such value, faced harsher outcomes. The scale of loss became clearer only with time. What had been one of the largest crusading efforts of its era had ended not in stalemate, but in decisive defeat. The consequences extended beyond the battlefield. For the Ottoman Empire, Nicopolis reinforced a pattern already in motion. Expansion into southeastern Europe would continue, not as isolated campaigns, but as a sustained process supported by administrative control and military consistency. The perception of Ottoman strength, already significant, became more concrete, not only among adversaries, but among potential subjects. For the Byzantine Empire, the implications were immediate. The possibility of large-scale Western intervention, of a coordinated effort capable of reversing Ottoman gains, had been tested. and it had failed. Whatever strategic hope had been attached to this campaign diminished sharply in its aftermath. The empire's position, already fragile, became more exposed. In Western Europe, the response was more complex. The defeat did not end the idea crusade, but altered its credibility. The assumption that numerical strength and heavy cavalry could guarantee victory against the Ottomans no longer held. Lessons, where they were recognized, pointed toward coordination, discipline, and the need to understand an opponent whose methods did not align with established expectations. But recognition did not always translate into change. At Nicopolis, the outcome had not been determined by a single decision. It had emerged from a sequence, an advance made without full alignment, a battlefield entered without complete understanding, a structure committed to early without support, and an opponent prepared not just to resist, but to absorb, adapt, and respond in stages. The Danube continued to move as it had before. The fortress of Nicopolis remained where it stood, its walls unchanged, its position constant, but the balance around it had shifted, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with a clarity that would shape the region for decades to come. What happened at Nicopolis was not simply a defeat. It was a demonstration of how different systems of warfare met, and how one, under pressure, failed to adapt quickly enough, and in that failure, the future direction of southeastern Europe became more certain, not because it had been decided in a single moment, but because, over the course of a single day, the limits of resistance had been revealed. Pierre,